Welcome to today's roundtable discussion about race. Last time we wouldn't say it was in North America. Um, well, we weren't sure if it was in America, North America, but we're going to start with a bang regarding that. I decided that the correct term for um, Mexican Americans, Mexicans, anybody from South and Central America should be Latin America. Latin American instead of Latino, because Latino has actually no meaning to anybody. Like Latino means that the Spaniards were conquered by the Romans, and their language comes from them, and then that was inherited onto us. And then Latino, without saying they were American, you're actually going along with the racist ideology of splitting up the continent into two or three because the people from the north don't want to be associated with the people from the south. So I know that we always bring up controversial stuff, but have you guys heard that in Europe there's only six continents instead of seven? That in North America they try to split up the continent to North and South America. So like that, you keep the people from the South in a different category or different section as compared to everywhere else in the world. They just say American. And when you hear someone, I'm an American, they're actually saying I'm not a European. So Mexicans are Americans, Argentinians are Americans because we're all from the continent of America. But here they try to say the Americas or whatever. And what they're doing is they're making up something that is not even correct. And they're claiming that being an American is better or more important. And I realized that I was using the term incorrectly because I told someone I'm a first generation American. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm a first generation US citizen. But I've always been an American because I was born in the Americas. Is that too much splitting hairs, or does that make sense to you guys?
I think that's what Angela was saying, wasn't it, kind of last week or the last time? You were kind of
Mhm.
saying like America is like all one America. And I know like often you hear that with First Nations, everybody's like our cousin, if they're like from the Americas. We talk like in the cousinhood. If you're indigenous to any area like South America, Central America, we're all cousins.
I like that.
So, and you're
Definitely.
right, because when you're brought over, like even I've heard like even tagging America onto that, like that can have a negative connotation, I feel like too. Like not everybody wants to be coined an American if you come from like another place, right? So then there's like that's where that distinguishing factor now comes in. Like or if you say just a generic you're Latin, now you kind of lose a bit of that area, which then loses a bit of, but not a bit, it loses the culture of the area, I would think.
Hmm hmm
Um, in one conversation, Gerald, you mentioned the idea of African Americans and people who are descendants of slaves in the U.S. Having a culture on themselves and feeling that that needs to be preserved as compared to being lumped with other groups like the Caribbean and Afro Latinos. Are they still part of your community, or are they a different subsection, or like is being black limited to a particular area of the world, or do you have like a brotherhood among all black people, but then you're sectioned off in regions?
Well, I was speaking in general terms with regard to ADOS, or American descendants of slavery, of descendants of slaves. I wasn't. I think that the connection is there between Africans that ended up in the Caribbean and America as at the states as well here. So I wouldn't say that there isn't. They're part of the African diaspora. And I wouldn't say that there is zero connection, but I think we have our own culture here. There's, black culture. There's a unique culture here that's somewhat different than um, than theirs. And I think that that's okay. I think that we unfortunately here in the States sometimes get lumped into this big. There's a tendency to lump people into under one umbrella because it makes it easier just to deal with all of them in a certain way. You kind of hinted at that, or we had a conversation about that conversations before when we talked about people being surprised at the way that folks from the so-called Latinx community voted in this past election. That they were surprised that there was so much support from some communities for Trump versus others. And I think that we can see that also happening with the way that people of color are lumped together under that umbrella as well. I think that we were pushed to kind of put everyone under this umbrella, or say if you've got one drop of black blood, you're black. And that's a lot of people under that umbrella that just don't fit. But I think culturally there are probably lots of connections that.
And just,
But that was it.
for our audience, the last show that we recorded was before the election, and this one's after.
Well,
So I know I have a big sigh of relief, even though there's still a lot of problems. We don't have blatant disregard for people who are different or have different perspectives. I was reading an article that was talking about how at one point there was more African descendants or descendants of slaves in Mexico. There was some here or certain areas of the U.S. And that was like it opened up something for me that in my ignorance I used to say that there was no black people in Mexico. And what I meant is that I wasn't exposed to black people in Mexico because they were erased just like native people of Mexico. And what happened was that when they brought people to Mexico, they mixed with the native population. So in this article, they were saying that most Mexican people have some African descendants in their heritage, and that's something that is kept hidden or even ignored because there's so much racism from the Spaniards. And there's a couple of prominent families in Mexico who are black or are African descendants, and they are famous or they're part of the entertainment field. But it's always kind of like in the 1930s way where they're accepted because they're very talented and because they are unique in their features and the way they perform or something like that. And that would be something that I also wanted to discuss. I feel that it's taken a lot for the African American community to be accepted or appreciated, and it has come because of the way that entertainment and Hollywood has been exploiting people or putting them in the forefront as because of their talent. The same with the sports field, and then now that people are successful and rich, now they're kind of bringing up other people from their communities. But I feel that the Latinos are kind of like lagging behind. They're like the next group. So you would see a movie in the 80s and there would be like a white guy who's like the main cop, and then he has a buddy who's black. Now you see like a black cop who has a buddy who's Hispanic, and you're still on the considered on the like the sidekick and not like the main liner. Have you guys seen that? And do they do that in I'm only seen so many Canadian movies or Canadian shows, but do they even consider like native Canadian actors or have them as like sidekick or someone who plays a role like the comedian or something like that? Or they're just not even brought into the picture?
I would say that they're not really represented very well. Like specialized movies, and very much like more um, ones that don't make mainstream media, like mainstream in the movie theater or Netflix or something like this. It would be kind of put on by the government arts council or something like that, as opposed to anything mainstream. It's very rare. I think I know an actress just recently is the very first Indigenous character in a Hallmark movie. And if you think about how many movies Hallmark has made, that's kind of insane. And that's like being celebrated right now in our community that she's the first one. She comes from my area of BC. So I would say no. No. We're not even the sidekick. We're not even like represented.
Yeah, I would back that up just from what I have experienced. Recently, I remember it was a big talk because Indian Horse it was on Netflix, and it was a or something that was like, wow, like it's the same way. It's like the arts, those that are committed to like having stories of not the dominant language being told, but you have to seek it, and it's definitely not anywhere near like the token sidekick role. Or I would say that what I have seen has been actually the opposite. I've seen quite a lot of that stereotypical misrepresentation that helps build the stereotypes of what an Indigenous community or a representative would be in a movie. Like I still see that um, with great sadness, like just watching that, if there is a character, it's often in the lower end of town on the edge, to show how scary it is, or something within, and I'm talking about mainstream Canadian representation. Yeah, it's I've noticed more lately, but only because I'm looking. Um, yeah.
And Gerald, yeah, I know that there was activism from black sports figures and actors that kind of helped the civil rights movement, like with Muhammad Ali and Belafonte. And do you feel that modern day like stars are taking a stand, or only like Colin Kaepernick and maybe a couple other people, and other people who maybe are too complacent or not speaking up when they should?
I think that we've seen more activism from the sports community, more so than mainstream kind of like singers and actors, things like that. I think that, and I think that's a good thing. I think that they're asserting their power and the platform that they have in ways that they weren't able to before. Um, and that will probably continue. I think because so many things have changed in the sports field, um, and a lot of, I mean, with regard to Kaepernick, the NFL has come back and said that they basically wish they had listened to him, that they had supported him, that he was right. Um, so I think that that legacy of activism from folks who have, that you would say have made it or who reached a certain amount of notoriety is pretty consistent. I don't know if they're funding this current movement or this current battle in the civil rights movement. I don't know if they're helping to fund the movement at the same level, but they're certainly much more visible. And I want to go back to your question about the sidekick. Do you want to be the sidekick? Do you want your community to play that role? Because I don't feel like anyone in Hollywood is embracing black folks necessarily. I think that a lot of it comes in waves, but that sidekick role can really mess you up, your larger community up, if that's the only experience that people have with seeing you driving Miss Daisy or doing some of this other stuff, being the magic Negro or the first person killed in the horror movie, or you're just there for diversity. So I wonder, are those the stories that you want to see come from your community anyway, or any of
Well,
our communities?
we have to give props to Will Smith and Jennifer Lopez because they actually like were headliners in many movies in the 90s and 2000s, and looking back, it's like unbelievable that they people went and saw the movie because they were the main character, and now I feel like it's kind of going back to, yeah, that was enough. Now we need to go back to the psychic role. Um, you know,
Mm,
You think so? E- Even with the demographics of the country changing, it seems like there's going to be a larger audience for, people who represent the, the largest segment of society, the larger segments of society.
let's see. What does Angela have to say?
I was gonna say that in that narrative, that storytelling of who is being represented and how, I fully agree. The sidekick, it's a support role, which is where what I've noticed from white culture, that is where the the non like the disenfranchised, it's like, yeah, we'll put you as a sidekick. You're the support to our narrative. So even when I've seen recently, since the BLM movement, I've seen and I've heard, I have friends that work in film, like all the stories, it's like one friend is working in film and he says he read the script and there is a black lead now, but the story is still a white narrative. And he's wondering if it was actually written to have a white lead, but now it's off trend to not have multiracial faces or people represented within whatever you're producing. So I know with me with fashion, since BLM, every shoot I've done has had a person of color. But I would say that in the past, it was very specific, usually a person of color that was instigating the model to be a person of color if I was working with someone not a white population. So I feel a lot of interest in, I've just been really researching and looking into where the point of view of the story is, like whose story is being told when a black body is being represented beside a white queen. That's not actually representing a, a black person. It's representing the white need for help, all about the center role. So centering white identity. What do you guys think about that?
I, with with fashion, I think that there's always the risk that if you use a black person or a person of color as a prop, that
Totally.
it can backfire on you because if it's a group and there's one black man or one black woman, your eye is going to go to them. Well, am I wrong? I don't know. I seems to me that that's the way that it would work. They become the actually the focal point, and you have to
It's
do
usually,
other things with your staging to
mhm.
kind of compete with that. So
Yeah, yeah. It's usually single models for selling the product. So it's a choice of who they're targeting. Um, yeah, and very much tokenism, I think otherwise. The group of white, usually one person of color, definitely one woman, make sure everything's represented. But you're right, that's where the eye switches to the, yeah,
Well, and in
visual.
Canada, they have the same problem as they do in the US, where they're trying to tap into single white male dollars or whatever coin you guys use over there. Um, the barter system or whatever you guys use. Um, so, there was this issue with, you say you want to talk about gender. This issue that a lot of the superheroes, they have very voluptuous women and model-looking people, whatever. And it's because young men are attracted to that, and then they're the ones buying the movies or buying the merchandise, and they say, well, we have to throw that in, and we have to make it interesting for them, and that's how they would justify all the shows being sexist. And it's like, well, they're the ones that have money. If we did a all feminist thing, nobody would watch it because they spend their money in other stuff. They don't spend it in stupid nonsense like these guys. So what do you guys think about the market pushing? So you were saying that as the population is growing, there's going to be more representation of minorities um, because they see themselves represented in the characters. In all the Marvel movies, there's like two black guys, and there's no Hispanic. There was a Native American in Suicide Squad, and he got killed in the first 2 minutes. Um, and I think the original character wasn't even Native American, so it stung even more to have him killed so quickly. So what do you think about the way that the women are represented to feed into that? Because if you're saying that if you have a black model and a white model, are they really selling that expensive clothes to black people, or are they selling it to rich white kids and they just put in a black person so they it seems like they're not racist? But the majority of that group might not even be able to buy that clothes. Have you
Well, this
considered?
is where what I was thinking too is like there is a fine line between it's always about the intention, I guess, behind everything because even like what Angela's saying, like if you're putting a black actor at the forefront, but the story and the character was actually written for a white, just generic white like narrative, then now you're actually talking about tokenism. Like if you're only putting somebody in there just to be right or politically correct or it's what's expected of us, then you're not actually advancing anything. And Reese Witherspoon actually, so going to the gender issue, she has broached this with her own production company where she is talking about women telling female stories, and she was told that that would be impossible, like nobody wants to buy that, and she's like, women are 51% of the population. Yes, women want to see stories about women, like, so back to what you were saying, like the thought process is so from the 1940s, like women now make their own money. We can afford to go to a movie. I don't have to get my husband to say yes, that he can take me to a movie. I don't need to appeal to what he wants to watch. I can go to the VIP theater, pay for myself, buy my own food with my girlfriend, and like watch what I want to watch. So the same thing goes when you talk about whether there's a need or a desire for stories told from a minority aspect when we're not actually the minority. We're only the minority when we group in all white cultures to one and then independently put us as our independent cultures. That's the only time that we can actually be considered minority. So of course there's people who want to give their dollars to see representation, but the representation has to be written by and for that culture. It can't be written by someone else from their viewpoint of what they think it's like to come from that cultural basis. So the reality is that we have to have more people writing of all kinds of different minor or ethnic groups, genders, different sexual orientations, etc. Because it's the only way that you kind of get the actual story truly told. And now you're not using like in tokenism, where you're just like, let's make a black movie for being black. Well, what happens when somebody who's non-black makes that movie? It becomes a stereotype, right? Almost immediately. Because what
Well,
kind of frame of reference can you write from?
there was a lot of complaints about Amistad, the Steven Spielberg movie about the group of slaves that rebelled, and that he was the one directing it. But I thought it was done appropriately and with respect. A movie that a lot of people love and they think that's like the best movie that just came out is the Spider-Man. There's a Afro-Latino Spider-Man, and I watched it with my kids, and I'm like, it has every single stereotype and every single way to minimize what they're trying to do. And I think that one of the writers was a Latino or something, but so he's a kid who ends up like the Fresh Prince. He ends up in a rich kid's school. His dad is a cop. His mom is a nurse. The dad is black. The mom is Puerto Rican. And then he has a uncle who's a criminal. And then Spider-Man comes from a different dimension and teaches him how to be Spider-Man. So he's the sidekick to the real Spider-Man who's white, and he's the Afro-Latino kid. And through the whole thing, he's like struggling. He doesn't know what to do. He's all like dorky and so even though it's like a journey of discovery and like a rite of passage, it shows that we need a lot of help. That like someone can be what is it, self idealized or whatever, not become
Actualized?
Realize.
actualized. They can become their true selves without the help of a white savior or someone who mentor, and then and he lives in a dangerous neighborhood, and his dad became a cop, so he can be the proper person, and it's like it's just a hot mess. But people think that it speaks to their experience, but it's like sometimes like you're never gonna make anybody happy, but if you look at it, it does kind of keep the stereotypes going. So the problem is like if we haven't even gotten out of the ghetto or the area where they have limited our resources and our opportunities, how can we tell a story that it is more mainstream or more universal when we still have all those issues? So I see what you're saying is that if you have like a black James Bond who never struggled with being discriminated, and he's just James Bond, but he's black, it doesn't make any sense because now you have a British black guy who's just happens to be rich and famous, and everybody loves him. There's been a couple of movies like that, and I won't even get into it because they made me so mad. But back to the subject. The this is the
Just
Go ahead, Gerald.
no, I just feel like the way that we're consuming media now is changing. Everyone, there are all these different platforms where you can, like with specialized content that are kind of geared towards your whatever your community or population you might, identify or associate yourself with. And I think that's what's driving that ultimately is what's going to be driving the changes in the way that groups are represented because this is a transitional time. I really feel like uh, it's when the characters that you describe that fit into the formula where they just plug a person of color into this role. Those spaces, they haven't changed. The space and I feel like it's still a white space, primarily set up for a white audience. But I think that what's coming now, it's a space. All these spaces and platforms are being created that can really truly tell more robust stories about all kinds of people that are closer to their lived experiences, or that are like with the Black Panther, even if it's not obviously that's a fantasy, but it's a I think we're in this transitional time that we're going to see more robust stories. I guess that's really what I wanted to say. It's like the transition when there was, if you were reporting, this is a separate example. There was a time when there were no women that could go into the locker room to interview women, reporters. But once there were women reporters in that space, the space had to change. It wasn't enough just to have, a woman reporter. Lots of things had to follow to change, and I think Hollywood is catching up.
Hmm.
And they're figuring out if they don't, a lot of these independent media makers are going to put them out of business.
Yeah, to carry on with that, when we were talking about representation in Canadian film, I wanted to say on the surface, Canada is quite connected to the United States. Like it's like the quiet version of a copycat on the surface. But then in the States, and what I watch when I'm going on TV now, the options I have are much greater. If I want to watch LGBTQ, if I want to watch women's stories, if I want to see multicultural stories, like the resources are there in spaces that they weren't there before. So the pull of who's actually like the media makers, they just want money. So who's watching and how do they feed that? And I would say that gratefully the voices of those watching is being actually heard, so that need to have more representation be seen. It's being taken out of the hands of the two. Hollywood isn't quite the only ruler of the media world now. So I totally agree, Gerald. That it is changing, and it's exciting to see the options that are starting to grow.
Well, we're gonna change the tone of the conversation from serious to hilarious and sad. So I'm talking.
Okay.
Hilarious and
No
sad.
pressure.
What?
This is right before the election.
That's that's expectational.
So right before the election, I neighbor, and she wears a Beto t-shirt. You know, Beto O'Rourke is known as the white guy who wants to be Mexican, or he's an honorary Mexican. And then we have Marco Rubio, who's like the Cuban who wants to be American or pretends to be white or whatever. So when I saw my neighbor wearing a Beto shirt, I knew she was cool because she was progressive and she supported a guy who likes Latinos from El Paso. He ran for Senate and lost or whatever. So just casually, I was talking to her about what's going on with the election and stuff like that. And she said something that like baffled me. She said, I have this friend and she's a Republican and we agree on every issue other than immigration. And I was like, oh, okay. And then she said, without any bones or issues, she said, my friend's problem is that she thinks there's too many Mexicans in Houston or in Texas. And I just couldn't believe it. She said it in front of my daughter, who we're building up a Latino identity or Latin American identity, going back to the beginning of the show. And it's this idea that, like I don't know if it was the Danish or who are the people from South Africa? What were they like?
Afrikaans.
No, but like the original people, the Dutch, they go
Dutch,
to
yeah.
Africa and then they complain there's too many Africans. And how can someone be so ignorant that moves to Texas and they say there's too many Mexicans? When Texas was part of Mexico, the majority of the cities have Spanish names. It's like a port city where there's a lot of work, so a lot of immigrants come. So you live in like the ant pile and you're complaining there's too many ants. And it just baffles that it's so this is the Trump factor for me, is that it's acceptable to hold that position. It's just a different position. So her progressive friend says, oh, we're best buds. We have everything in common, but she hates people from Mexico and she doesn't want them around. And it's like, you might, like, there used to be a time when people could say that in closed doors or among their friends. Yeah, they need to get rid of them, you know, ship them away or whatever. Now it's like you can just say it. There's too many Mexicans. And then to my face, so she's like repeating it, but she didn't say it. She's repeating it, but she's like talking to the horse. And it's like it just baffles the mind. Like, I've said a couple of things here and there, but you know, we know about the thing of passing as white. So if I say, you know, white people are losing it or something like that, people stare at me and like, how dare you? You're a Mexican. How can you say that? But like I was telling you guys that there's different categories. So in Mexico, if you're light skinned, you're considered white. But then when you come to America, you're no longer white. Now you're a Mexican. So it's very complicated. But going back to this issue where you can just blatantly say, I know someone who finds your people repugnant and that your people need to go. And it's like, how is that a thing? Like I know that in Germany they say, you know, we don't like Jews, get rid of them. Or in Africa, South Africa, we just want a population where there's no black people. We just want to be all around our own people and they can go do their thing somewhere else. So it's like, how is that acceptable? How are we supposed to tolerate that type of mentality? And then it's part of the conversation. So is that like a vestige of this colonialism and lack of understanding of even history and population, migration and stuff like that, that you're just going to assume that wherever you're at, your people need to be in control and everybody else needs to like get out of their face? Or is it part of the Trump factor and the normalization of racism where you can just say, if I'm driving down the street and I see someone I don't like, they shouldn't be here, they should go back or whatever. What do you guys think? Like, do you have the same kind of like horrible reaction to hear someone be that foolish and inappropriate?
Well, I know as a hairdresser that people will always talk to you as if you're on the same page as them. So there's like, I think as human nature, we kind of go through the world assuming everybody comes from the same place we do, which is why we can project ourselves onto other people or whatever. So I think there's a little bit of that, but it also leads to the normalization of one culture, right? Where everything that's not that culture is different and abnormal. So this is the whole like term white supremacy, which like gets misused harshly, but it really is just about the dominant culture, and this is what's normalized, and therefore like everything else is deemed different, so up for conversation, right? That's why cultural appropriation can happen, because it's deemed different. And so I want to appreciate that thing that's different, as opposed to, and like, so I'm appreciating it, not appropriating it because it's different. Well, that's only different because one culture has deemed itself the normal, and that's the so-called dominant culture that's supposed to blanket all cultures, so therefore we can all have that conversation. We can just have the conversation out in the open, which I find just equally as appalling. I think it's wild that somebody from another culture can like assume so much in a conversation and act like they can just have a conversation about it, like and I have a hard time even like putting words to it, but like they're hypothesizing and saying, let me deem whether this is an actuality or not. So it's like, it's not a reality to them. They're just sort of, let's just hypothesize on this for a minute. I find it wildly crazy to me as well. I'm with you.
How about you, Gerald? What do you think?
I mean, I would say, thinking back to a conversation that we had way back months ago about sharing space, information, resources, and power with Black folks, this country has always had a problem doing that. And so I kind of feel like what's happening now, and I don't know if it's necessarily because of Trump or just because of racism, as people have historically experienced it in America, is much more open and widespread. But I think we're renegotiating this idea of who has access to public space. Who can be in your community, who can walk down the street. There are lots of folks, they're not used to seeing Black. I'm talking about Blacks specifically. And there are areas that you're not supposed to be in. That's that people, and it's also, I think we have to recognize that it's like you have to walk two roads. You have to walk that road where you're meeting a person where they are with where they are with their level of understanding about differences and culture and history, and you don't want to you don't want to shut them down or give them reason to even dig deeper into this attitude that they have towards you or other people of color. But at the same time, you don't want to let that kind of behavior pass. You want to confront what they're saying. So I just feel like as a Black male, I wouldn't, if someone had said something like that to me, it would kind of be a yeah, whatever, and then I would have moved on. Um, it, or it would have been let me take the time. If I felt it was important to take the time to try and educate that person, I would. But I know that there are just some people who are never going to embrace folks that are different from them. They're not going to do it. They don't feel bad about your suffering or your lived experiences, uh, as a result of what they say and kinds of things they say and do. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. Are you asking is it becoming normalized, and is that a good thing, or?
Well, no, I like your. It, I was watching there's a documentary called what is it? Sorry, it's about people in movies representing indigenous people, and they call it the movie's called the Good Injun, and what
What?
they're saying,
Are you
yeah,
serious?
it was made by a Native American activist, and it's about how they had all these people, Marlon Brando, and all these people in brown face, portraying Native Americans because they claim they couldn't find any. That they went around and they could, and I guess they didn't want to have a Mexican play an indigenous person. They even went as far as having Italians play Mexicans when they were making spaghetti westerns. But back to the subject, there's that fragility. This is what the filmmaker said. Fragility is a privilege. That all the people, and we're going to talk about microaggressions and all that, that the people who can be offended and can be upset and the social justice warriors, that's from a place of privilege. That indigenous people and African Americans and other groups, they have to be strong and they have to kind of let it pass because if not, it would tear them apart. So the part of the resilience of the minority population is to not let things get under your skin because it would be too much to handle. So that to survive in the world, you have to be tough-skinned and you have to kind of rise above people's stupidity. So I like what you're saying that there's some people that you're just not gonna waste your time, but it takes a lot of energy and it takes a lot of boldness to be like, wait a second, that was like awful and I don't appreciate it and let me tell you why. And people feel then they get offended or they feel uncomfortable and then and then they tell you you have a chip on your shoulder, or in my case, a tortilla chip on my shoulder. That's an old joke of mine. So you just let it go and be like, you know what, move on. But if you let it keep happening, then people think it's okay. And that's why I have a lot of problems with Latino comedians that all they do is joke about getting deported, and all they joke about is their mom hitting them with a sandal and all the stupid stuff that they showed in the movie Coco and other places where they play into the stereotypes and they try to like turn it around and it actually doesn't do anything. It's cheap shots against yourself. So I don't know. So I just think that there has to be a bigger conversation, and we're having the conversation, and a lot of the people are not. I remember I was working catering at a party at a rich neighborhood, and it was when Trump called Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas. And I was just hanging out, like trying to listen to what the rich people were saying. It was like a Christmas party. And one of the kids started like, Pocahontas this and Pocahontas that for no reason. And it was like normalized. And now he could use it and throw it out and his hatred of this woman. And they can just say, well, she's terrible, I don't like her, whatever. Now they have to use the racial epithet to put her down, that the other jerk already said it's okay. So I feel that it takes a lot of work to kind of get people out of that space where now they have permission to be ignorant and abusive. What do you think, Angela?
Oh, I was just gonna jump the article sent us, Jerald, is tying in nicely because when you were sharing, David, about that experience of I'm assuming this is a horrible assumption, the friend that or the colleague that was talking to you about her friend that doesn't like too many Mexicans, was that the woman that was speaking to you? Was she a white woman?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for me, that's that woman she should have talked to that other friend. That's her job to say, I don't, she's taking that and putting it on you, saying, now you have to hear that and teach me what I need to do to, I'm going to share it. It's of all the reading and the learning I've been doing lately, it's that awareness in the article you sent of when discussions are being had within the community that is ostracizing another community or disempowering a community through microaggressions, like that's not even a microaggression, but something. It's me. I have friends around me that are like radicals. They're working at change, and then they'll say something that's so tiny but so and when I try and discuss it, Angela, you're always just trying. It's just so small. It's just this thing, and it's like. It's not. And that's that privilege of, to you, it seems small. But so having that courage within the community that is being, I guess, empower, like in the position of power without even having that knowledge of what it is to be abusive through repetition. Like I've learned that as being a gender, as being woman, I've had so much abuse just through repetition of abusive acts. Like making a joke about it repeats it. It's still here. You're saying it's okay. You're normalizing it. So I have empathy with what it is when you are at that dinner party, when, like what you were saying, what used to be done behind closed doors. Unfortunately, I'm at that closed door, and having to deal with the discomfort even within the empowerment of like, well, I'm a woman, so when that white man says that, how safe is it to respond to that? Like, or even just male, like that needs to change. That structure of silencing when you've heard it, or bringing it to you to try and say, hey, you know, doesn't that suck? Because it's not taking ownership for what you've received. Is trying to give it to you instead. Like anyway, I don't know if you felt like that, but that's what I see when I hear that story. I get infuriated that that step forward of being aware of the power of the words you're saying. Even if you think you're being a supporter, you're not being empathic. You're not thinking about what it is to be in the position of hearing you say that to somebody. It can bring up things for you that it does not bring up for her, you know? So is that an incorrect, like, if what I just said, what does that make you feel like? Like,
Well, it
how,
kind of makes me think about like the thing of passing as white, or people see you and they assume things. So maybe she thought I would agree with her. Like that's the problem, is like sometimes people throw things out to see what you say. And then if I started saying, yeah, there is too many Mexicans, like I wish they would all go back. I can stay because I'm cool. They all can go. Then you're like part of the in crowd. And
mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can be a double agent and kind of trick people or something, like I don't know. But it's just
Your friend, the one that was saying there's too many Mexicans?
no, I was saying that if I did
Okay.
say that, like it was a
Yes.
test, like you could say, well, it's a test, but
Yeah.
people are not aware. And the thing is, and it go back to what Gerald was saying, is like you can't be the thought police, and this is where the social justice warriors think they're doing a great service, calling out every microaggression and every Twitter thing they don't like and trying to cancel everybody out. They think that by sitting back in their chairs complaining that that's going to change the world. And what they're actually doing is at times they're actually radicalizing people more, because then they use
Mm-hmm.
that as an excuse. They say like, oh, because you're such a whiny person, then now I'm going to do it more. And that just shows that you're fragile and that you're a snowflake or whatever. So, but when you're having these like serious conversations with people that you love, and you're challenging them to not be so dismissive of other people or so judgmental, that's where it's really painful. And it's really, if you tell a stranger, hey, stop being a jackass, what is that going to do? Like, but when
Yeah.
you're telling people that you care about, and I hate that you're in that position, Angela, that you're the one who has to bring it up all the time, and then you become the target. I know that in the civil rights movement, there was people who were risking their lives to to represent themselves as individuals or communities, and then everybody else tell them, you need to get out of Dodge. It's not your fight. Why are you getting involved? And I have a friend who started the podcast with me, who went to one of the protests against the black, and I thought he was going to get killed because I was worried about how bad these contractor security forces they have are, and that him not being of native descent, that he was going to stick out, and then they were going to beat him up even more, or that he would be seen as this hippie white kid causing trouble, whatever. So I was being protective of him, and then it's like, well, unless we get kind of like Martin Luther King did, where he got rabbis and nuns and different people to come with him, then they wouldn't beat all of them up because they look really bad. When it was just black people, then nobody complained. But once you got other people's support, then it became a more noticeable attack against humanity. Um, do you guys want to discuss the other topics that we brought up during our pre-conversation, such as this, like pronouncing people's names properly. Jerald, can you tell us about the article and how is that? What is the author saying regarding that?
Sure. I mean, I shared the article because I knew we were going to talk a little bit about the controversy around the use of the term Latinx, and I just think that there's the the author basically said that it's important to take the time to pronounce your students' names properly because it's a name is so closely tied to your identity. It's tied to your culture. It's tied to the intentions of your parents. And for someone to feel that they can just they, that they don't have to take the time to learn a child's name, it's very disrespectful, and particularly depending on the who you are as a teacher. But I thought that it was interesting because when I read another article that I didn't share, which I had about the history of the Latinx word, the term Latinx, and I think a lot of times when people self get there, I think that there hasn't always been the language for the way that people navigate through their lives, their experiences. So when you hear terms like cisgendered and Latinx, excuse me, there are lots. I mean, I'm an old dude. I'm trying to keep up with all the new terms, this new language for things, so that I can better understand the way people's lived experiences. And so the article basically said that it's important to take the time to do that, particularly if you're a white teacher and you're dealing with black students, because you could be signaling um, a, a dismissal of their humanity and not really realize it. Or their parents might interpret your decision to rename, their child, to a name that's more convenient for you, as you not caring enough about their child to take the time to really to get to know them as an individual or fully see them. Another way of saying all of that is just that when if we don't take the time to really know each other, then we're never going to be able to express or fully experience our own humanity. That's how it works. Especially if we're using language that and labeling people and boxing them and putting them in categories that they haven't put that they haven't embraced themselves. So I'll end it there because I'm starting to stutter a little bit.
No,
But
we have to like deconstruct the whole issue with Latinx, and the Latino community is very complicated. And what I want is for people to have some, you know, a lot of people use Christianese terms, so they say, well, have some grace, understand people, and give them some mercy or some ability to still be in the process of growth. So in the Latino community, there's taboos, there's superstition, there's traditionalist views, and what I don't want for my children is to say that white liberal culture is better than traditionalist Latino culture. Because once you start doing that, you're back to the colonial thing. And you can say that the traditionalist Latino culture is colonial, but then you look at different groups throughout the world, and they have the Orthodox community, like the staunch traditionalists, and then you have the more progressive among all different groups. So the Latino community being so traditionalist, and this is the Trump factor again, he played into traditionalist fears and traditionalist views to get all the people from El Paso to vote for him and the border region, to get a lot of the Cubans to vote for him, because they have these views about pro-life and pro-family and all these things. And for someone to, a European American to say, well, that's a bunch of crap, I don't want nothing to do with that, we're all progressive and everybody needs to get on the boat, that is a form of I don't know if it's like moral colonialism or suppressing of people's hard-held beliefs. Because now you're saying that what people find as a source of strength or source of family unity, whatever, that all that stuff needs to go away. That everybody needs to be open to everything and everyone and have all kinds of willingness to not be secluded in their own ways of thinking. So the Latinx term is active term to accept the transgender community or the LGBT community. And it's kind of like sticking into the face of the Latino community who's very anti-LGBT. So then the question is, well, shouldn't you do that on every front? Shouldn't it be the black X and the white X and the every X? Because the X represents that you're not going to call someone a Latino or a Latina. You're going to call them a Latinx because they could be from either gender or from the new ways of looking at genders and sexuality. So that's where the term comes from, what I know. And then to go back and share that with, to start defining people as that when they might not feel that that's the right way to be identified, that's where it's created conflict. So there was like a senator or somebody that they said, you need to stop using that term, because when you go to the Latino community, you go to inner city and you say, you know, what race are you? And you put Latinx, it doesn't mean anything to them. Or it even has like a negative reaction. Is that what you read in the article, Jerald? Did it talk about that it was a progressive effort to bring about more acceptance? Or was there another way to define the term?
The article did cover that in saying that it created a space for the lived experiences of folks who are part of the Latino community, but they weren't able to fully communicate who they are because the language didn't allow it. There was, and so it's like with anything, they get that space for themselves. And it's my understanding that the X actually is much broader, that it means that you're under the umbrella, but you're lots of things. It's more tailored individual's personal identity. So yeah, that's the take that I got from the article that I read. But I'm curious to know, do you guys? Where else? The anger around the word is confusing to me, because I want to know where else can folks that are part of this community go to raise issues about, not feeling that they're fully a part of, feeling that, there's no language. If you're feeling something, there's no language for it. That's a weird place to be. Am I sounding crazy? Does it?
Well, I think that's the problem. I think it's because there is a gendered language there. So, like, there is no need to put black X because black is just not gendered, whereas Latina and Latino is a gendered title, So that's why they don't feel like they're part of it. If you're LGBTQ or you're undefined or you don't gender yourself or whatever, they don't feel included when it's Latina or Latino. That literally just came to me as we were having this discussion, by the way. So there isn't a need for it anywhere else unless you're talking about a gendered language, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I got a light bulb when you said that. I'm sorry to jump in. I didn't interrupt you, Angela. Were you?
Go ahead.
No, I got a light bulb because, for example, just when the black community came up with Black Lives, and the response was all Black Lives Matter. That's an even bigger space, because the group that said it was the LGBT trans community matters too. So when folks from that community get killed, be as upset about it as you are about black males that are killed. When black women are killed, be upset about that as much as you are about, so all Black Lives Matter. and at the same time they were making a statement to the Black community, but also to the larger white community, and saying all of us were ditto what they said, with us and with us being centered. And I think that that was so. I think it can happen in in languages that aren't gendered, but it's the status of the person maybe that has that that shapes um, how far this message can go, or how far the space that they're creating with the language can go.